What if everything you knew about right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust, what if it was all wrong? This was the radical thought proposed by German philosopher and reason I had a terrible moustache for a year, Friedrich Nietzsche. He was one of the first philosophers to look at our moral system with its value on sympathy, kindness, selflessness and altruism, and say that this is not only arbitrary, but actually undesirable. It is this that has earned him his reputation as the philosopher par excellence for edgy teenage boys rebelling against their parents. But rarely do we stop to consider just how radical his view on morality is, and how it turned the world of philosophy inside out. In this video, we'll learn why Nietzsche hated Christian morals, how being a good person can make you miserable, and why so-called moral people are secretly liars. But first, let's learn exactly how Nietzsche thought our current moral system came about. 1. Nietzsche's history of morality. In the Peter Schaffer play, Amadeus, the composer Salieri develops an obsession and an envy of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Whereas Salieri had to work hard to become a successful composer, Mozart writes far greater music than he ever did, seemingly with no effort. Enraged and resentful, Salieri sets out to ruin Mozart, tarnish his career, and eventually murder him with poison. Since the play's premiere, Salieri has become a near-universal symbol of the destructive power of resentment. Salieri gains no joy in his vengeance. His resentment ultimately destroys him just as much as it destroys Mozart, because it was not aimed towards becoming better. It was aimed at bringing Mozart down to his level. His life's mission was not the betterment of himself, but the constraint of others. On Nietzsche's view, our entire moral system was constructed by resentful people just like Salieri. He paints a picture of history that is somewhat fictional, but is meant to chart the general course of the creation of a moral system. Initially, when man is just beginning to form tribes and societies, the most powerful people rise to the top, and it is they who get to decide what is good. And they don't have a hard time deciding. They immediately define good as all the qualities that they possess. That is, strength, competence, and the ability to dominate. Nietzsche is quick to emphasize that this is not all crude individualistic hedonism. With strength and competence comes the ability to be dependable and useful. And with the ability to dominate also comes the ability to protect and provide, both for oneself and for one's fellows. At this point, it is not selflessness or altruism, and certainly not weakness, that is desirable. It is instead personal excellence. This is what Nietzsche refers to as noble morality, or master morality. For Nietzsche, the morality's defining characteristic is that it is constructive. It starts by defining good practically out of nothing. It also has a concept of bad, but only in the sense of a lack of the qualities that are considered good. It is almost like an afterthought. This is why Nietzsche thought this type of morality was life-affirming. It gave people something to strive towards. It was active, energetic, and strengthened people's wills. On a wider scale, it led to successful societies who were able to conquer rivals, subjugating them and ensuring the prosperity of their own civilization. But with conquering and the will to dominate others, inevitably emerges some form of caste system. There are the conquerors and the conquered, the powerful and the powerless, or as Nietzsche puts it, the master and the slave. And just as there is master morality, over time there will emerge slave morality. The subjugated class will not put up with their treatment forever. It will cause them to resent their dominators. As a result, anything the master morality deems good, the slave morality will consider to be evil. Where the aristocrat values strength, the serf will value weakness. Where the master values a will to dominate, the slave will value submission and obedience. And where the nobleman values the ability to do great deeds both for good and for ill, the servant will instead value harmlessness. Nietzsche thought that all of this was perfectly understandable. After all, if you've been dominated, you know how unpleasant it feels, and you're going to find it very difficult to value domination. But Nietzsche points out a fundamental difference between this slave morality and the former master morality. Whereas the powerful defined good out of nothing and only then moved on to define bad in opposition to that, the starting point of the morality of the powerless is to demonize anything that the powerful have. There is no aspiration here at all, apart from to weakness and incompetence, at least according to Nietzsche. And for Nietzsche, this slave morality found its pinnacle in Christianity. All the Christian values, helping others, loving your enemies, praying for the souls of your tormentors, the idea of the meek inheriting the earth, all of it is aimed at demonizing strength and domination in favor of passivity and submission. It is the quintessential example of a slave morality. And Nietzsche points out that it has overcome the whole of Europe and beyond. A key concept to introduce here is the will to power. Nietzsche thought that every human had in them a will to dominate other people and their environment, to enforce their will on the universe, to change things and reshape the world as they would want it. It is this will that makes the powerful want to dominate the powerless, and it is the same instinct that makes the powerless take their revenge by slowly switching the values of society. So to recap, Nietzsche thought that our current moral system was brought about, in effect, by a resentful revolt, where the subjugated had their revenge on their dominators by slowly morphing the values of society so the highest good was no longer defined by the powerful, but by the powerless. It's a strange picture to get your head round. Now, you might say, but so what? Should we not encourage altruism, selflessness, and helping other people? And Nietzsche would say this is a fair question. But he says there are huge problems with making these our universal moral concepts. And that is what we shall move on to next. And if you want more on philosophy and the art of learning, subscribe to my email list. The link is in the description. 2. The consequences of mediocrity. In Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, it tells the tale of a man whose life has been torn apart by passivity and mediocrity. He makes endless promises to himself about everything from great deeds he will commit to evil acts he will undertake. What he actually wishes is besides the point. What's important is what happens next, which is nothing. He does not act, and he does not attempt to change the world in any way. It would not matter whether the man from the underground was the evilest creature in history or the kindest soul to walk the earth. He is ineffectual, so it simply does not matter either way. He has no will, no strength, and no ability to make things happen. And this is what Nietzsche is worried will happen to us if we throw ourselves wholeheartedly into slave morality. According to Nietzsche, the two factors that drive slave morality are resentment and fear of strength. We will discuss resentment later, but for now, let's focus on this intense fear of the powerful, and even of power itself. Nietzsche points out the profound and the obvious, that in order to achieve anything, you need to be powerful. Any person who has done anything of significance, by necessity, had to have extreme strength or extreme competence, or both, unless they changed the face of the world by complete accident. This is true for the generous philanthropist who uses their great resources to help others, and the imperialist general who uses the same resources to subjugate millions. The point for Nietzsche is you cannot have one without the other. You cannot create extraordinary men without creating extraordinary monsters. Sometimes they might even come in the same package. Famously, Nietzsche described Napoleon as a great mix of monster and superior man. For Nietzsche, a fear of power is only going to suppress those people who are able to rise above the rest and become extraordinary. If Napoleon had adopted the belief that it was better to be powerless and meek than powerful and strong, then he would have never changed the face of Europe forever. According to Nietzsche, the moment we fear power, we are working against ourselves, our societies, and the overall success of the species. At the beginning of the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche says he is going to put aspects of our morality to the test to see if they promote greater utility and prosperity, both to the individual and to the society they belong to. For Nietzsche, the fear of power fails on both counts. In the case of the individual, it means that only those who have no vision will end up happy or fulfilled. And in the case of society, it means it will never produce people able to make great leaps forward for the sake of their communities. Had Napoleon just been a bit more skilled, he might have conquered the whole of Europe, and I would be speaking French right now. Nietzsche asks us whether Napoleon would have succeeded had France not been inculcated with centuries of Christian values. So Nietzsche encourages us to let go of our fear of power. If we do not, then we are dooming both ourselves and our societies to insignificance. It is only a matter of time. But perhaps this strikes you as a little bit speculative. I must say that it seems a bit of a stretch to me at points. Outwardly Christian societies have been some of the most successful and powerful in history, although Nietzsche would say that that is only because they had not yet completely embraced slave morality. However, Nietzsche makes a further critical argument. Slave morality will make us miserable. 3. Resentment, self-destruction, and morality. I talked a little bit earlier about the idea of our system of values coming from the powerless resenting the powerful. But for Nietzsche, building anything on a foundation of resentment like this is complete disaster. This is because it alienates us from the very thing we want to become and makes us miserable as a result. This is all a bit abstract, so let's bring it down to earth with a story often used to illustrate this point. Aesop's fable of the sour grapes. Aesop tells of a fox who is jumping to get some grapes that hang off a nearby tree. Having failed to catch them a number of times, the fox gives up and remarks that the grapes were probably sour anyway. This soothes the fox in the moment, but fundamentally, it dooms him to never getting the grapes. If another fox were to come along and somehow manage to catch the grapes, our hero would become resentful. He would on the one hand still desire the grapes, but on the other hand, he is demonizing the grapes as not worth having. This contradiction will eat him up inside as long as he continues to deny his will to grapes. Now replace grapes with something much more significant, like power or achievement or influence. These are things Nietzsche thinks all people want to a greater or lesser degree, but they're also the very things condemned by slave morality. The trouble is, just saying they're evil is not enough to get people to stop wanting them. For Nietzsche, it is basically impossible to stop wanting them because they stem from the base human instinct aligned at preserving and bettering our lives, the will to power. Far from actually stemming the urge, the person living under slave morality is told that a fundamental and unchangeable part of themselves is evil, and that they are reprehensible for having it. This may stop them from following their will to power, but it will also torture them inside. It will create generations of miserable, self-hating people who have had their aspirations to greatness crushed. It condemns us both to despair and to mediocrity. And when we are living our mediocre lives, we will look at those whose will to power has not been suppressed, who are out in the world achieving great things, or just trying to achieve great things, and we will be deeply resentful. We will look at those more powerful or successful than us and tell ourselves that they must be evil, or that what they have is not worth our time. We will tell those struggling to fulfill their potential as human beings that they are wasting their lives, and that they will never get anywhere. Who knows? Maybe in both cases we'll be right. But whether right or wrong, we will continue to say it, because the alternative is deeply painful. That we once had the potential to strive for greater things in life, but now this has passed, and we are condemned to live out the same monotonous days until we die an unfulfilled death. For Nietzsche, a substantial critique of our current moral system is that it does not do what it proclaims to do. Being good is meant to be useful and life-fulfilling. But in Nietzsche's analysis, being meek, mild, passive and selfless does none of those things. All it does is condemn us to a life of constant frustration as we deny our will to power. It is, in his view, a deeply dishonest way to live. And that is exactly what we're going to move on to next. 4. The moral man. We all know someone who through their moral system has become completely insufferable. The kind of person who will lecture you over dinner and hold everyone around them to impossible moral standards that they have not agreed to. They display no interest in constructing their own novel ideas, but are largely occupied with condemning the people around them for various sins, especially those who have more joyful lives than they do. This is Nietzsche's idea of the moral person, who he invokes at various points both in Beyond Good and Evil and the Genealogy of Morals. From one perspective, they're doing something perfectly unobjectionable. They're simply upholding the values of their moral system. But Nietzsche does not buy this story in the slightest. He charges the moral person with a fundamental dishonesty about their motivations. Righteous anger is a familiar concept. It's essentially when someone gets angry and attempts to change another person's behavior, but from a moral standpoint. This sort of anger has motivated everything from the expansion of human rights to the massacring of different religious denominations. Looking at it as a historical phenomenon, Nietzsche notes that it is basically an amoral force. It is simply one group of people attempting to enforce their morality on others. In other words, it is the angry person's expression of their will to power. And it is important to note that Nietzsche doesn't see anything inherently wrong with this. He thinks it is only natural to want to assert your will against others. He would not judge any of these people for their wish to change the world to better themselves and people like them. He merely points out that far from being a crusade for metaphysical truth or justice, all it is the will to power with a good PR campaign. But the trouble with this dishonesty is that it fundamentally limits the will to power. It means we can only assert our will when we come up with some theoretical justification for it. And if we're stuck in slave morality, these constraints will be very tight indeed. Again, Nietzsche points out the stifling effect of morality on those he considered exceptional. The very thing that made Napoleon great in the eyes of Nietzsche was his assertion of his will to power despite having no moral justification for wanting to conquer the whole of Europe. It was his ability to act beyond good and evil that set him apart from the rest. If he had instead spent his time wringing his hands over whether he was acting morally, he would have never made his mark on history. And this is part of what makes reading Nietzsche on morality so difficult. It is hard to overstate just how radical a departure this is from previous philosophical analyses of good. Whereas Aristotle, John Stuart Mill and Kant all asked what good was in and of itself, Nietzsche treats morality as a set of concepts humans use and simply describes it, highlighting the elements where it may work against us rather than for us. Whereas philosophy has tended to ask what is good, Nietzsche asks what is good for. But there is one question we must all now ask ourselves. What do we do with Nietzsche's analysis? 5. What next? Nietzsche's analysis of morality is one of the most controversial theses in philosophy. It is anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian, and stands against almost everything we intuitively consider good. And this is by design. But what can we do with this information? Are we to abandon our old values and forge new ones that prioritize strength, will, and domination? Well, that is what some people take from it. But if you don't want to go that far, and not many people do, there is still brilliant insight to be found in Nietzsche's thoughts here. Firstly, it shows how strength and power do not need to be bad things. The ability to be a great benefactor to humanity goes hand in hand with the ability to do great harm. A morality that glorifies weakness and meekness to the exclusion of self-betterment and competence is doing a disservice to its followers by actively making their lives worse. Secondly, it suggests that we should perhaps be a little more skeptical of those who build their identity around being moral. Nietzsche's observation that professions of goodness can cloak a hidden will to power is a wonderful piece of cynical wisdom. Bewaring the person who wields morality like a knife is pretty good advice for our interpersonal lives. And lastly, and most importantly, it shows that we should not take our fundamental concepts for granted as if they were above criticism. Good and evil, truth and falsity, appearance and reality, these are not holy relics beyond critique. We can question them, interrogate them, and see if they're doing the job we want them to do. We don't have to outright abandon them, but we may want to alter them slightly for the betterment of ourselves and our societies. Nietzsche, more than any other Western philosopher before him, reminds us of our freedom to choose our values. The subtitle of Nietzsche's book Twilight of the Idols is How to Philosophize with a Hammer. And this sums up Nietzsche's approach wonderfully. Nietzsche is destroying the old philosophical assumptions that goodness and evil exist, or even that goodness is good, and he makes way for a new type of philosopher. One that will brush away the smashed fragments of these old systems and create new ones. Ones that encourage an engagement with the world that is powerful, active, loving, and above all, life-affirming. I do encourage you to read Nietzsche for yourself to get your own insights here, as I've had to skip over much of the detail. The two key texts to pick up for this aspect of his philosophy are Beyond Good and Evil and The Genealogy of Morals. And if you want some more constructive Nietzschean philosophy, then click here to learn about his radical doctrine of loving one's fate, no matter what happens. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.